Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you happen to be. Welcome to episode 50 of the Groovy Podcast. My name is Ken Cousin. I am sitting here with Graeme, Rocher, and Jeff Brown. We are all together at the G3 Summit, which is currently going on in Austin, Texas this week. So we definitely wanted to take the opportunity to talk about Grails and how it's going in the future and everything like that. For those people who, I can't imagine there's much of an overlap with people who have listened to the Groovy Podcast and don't know either of you. But just for the sake of argument, do you want to say a moment about who you are and what role you play in all of this, just in case?
Yeah, sure. Graeme Rocher. I'm the co-founder and project lead of Grails.
Yeah, I'm Jeff Brown, and one of the other co-founders of the framework and the practice lead, the Grails practice lead at OCI, which of course is the home of the Grails team and has been for the last almost 3 years now. Yeah.
We have our little Grails banner right behind us and everything coming from OCI. We'll try not to comment on the orange color involved in all that. I promise not to bring it up. So, okay.
Thank you.
Yesterday, as part of the beginning of the conference, there was a keynote address both by Paul King, who I'll be talking to later, and then a second part by Graeme discussing the changes in the Grails framework and the future and what's going on with that. Is there anything particular out of that you want to mention? I mean, I'll come up with things to ask you about, but I was just wondering, can you want to summarize what's the status of Grails and what's coming in the future?
Yeah, sure. So as for those who were lucky enough to see the keynote, I talked about the latest release of Grails, which is 3.3. That's the current major release. And there's a whole bunch of exciting features in that, like GORM data services, which is part of GORM 6.1, the new event system, the new version of JSON views, and so forth. Going into the detail and being able to talk about all those great new features was awesome. And of course, then discuss the future roadmap, which looking out and towards 2018, where we have Grails 4 on the horizon, the work that we're undertaking on what we're calling Project Particle, which is not ready for public consumption yet, but
don't worry, nobody's listening anyway. It's all right.
No. And a whole bunch of exciting stuff. I think 2018 is going to be exciting.
One of the things that seemed to strike me from the presentation was, well, there are a couple things. First of all, one is I've been looking at Grails a lot more recently.
Yeah.
And I am amazed how different it is now than even what I was accustomed to as recently as a year ago or whatever. I mean, I've been using Grails for many, many years, and this is not your predecessor's Grails framework. It really is different. But the thing that you were pointing out in the keynote is how stable 3.3 really is. I did not get the impression that there is a major version release imminent. I mean, that there's a lot of planning going on for major releases, but that if you want to adopt Grails 3.3 right now, that really is the preferred approach. Is that reasonable to say?
Absolutely. Grails 3.3 is mature, stable, robust, tested, and perfect for building applications today. Obviously, we have a roadmap planned out with the next major releases, and those are on the horizon. But in terms of building applications today, Grails 3.3 is a great place to start.
Now, you mentioned that the data services. Jeff had mentioned that to me earlier. I know, of course, I've been working with GORM since I started working with Grails at all. How is the data services approach changing anything or affecting the approach to Grails now?
Yeah, the data services stuff that Graeme introduced last night during the keynote. So it's called GORM Data Services, and it's a new feature or set of features included in GORM 6.1. And it's a little bit tricky to talk about without being able to look at some code samples and demos and so forth. But it's this really, really innovative, productive, and efficient way to define your data layer, right? So you can write an interface that describes your interactions with the database And Gorm can generate all the logic and transaction management and generate most of your data access layer for you at compile time. So it's really, really cool stuff. And one of the benefits of that, there are a bunch of benefits, but one of the nice things about it is it's really encouraging people to follow a better best practice for building web front ends to, or even REST API front ends to your database. One of the things that folks have commonly done with Grails in the past is in your controllers, you're invoking methods like domain class.list and creating an instance and calling .save. And that demos well, and the scaffolding did that. And so folks kind of followed that did that a lot in their applications. That complicates transaction management. It complicates a number of things. Really, a better idea is for your data access stuff to be in a service and not to be doing any transactional stuff in your controllers. And the Gorm Data Services, while it's not designed specifically for that problem, a nice side effect of the way Gorm Data Services works is it's encouraging people to do the right thing, to not put your data access in the controller, have it in a service, have the service injected into your controller, and then you get to take advantage of all the stuff that Gorm Data Services has to offer from that point. Like I said, it's a little bit tricky without some code samples and or even slides of code, but it's a really simple way to define your data access layer, and it's encouraging people to follow what I think is a best practice, which the previous scaffolding, I think, kind of recommended a not great practice.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And actually, that's where I encountered it for the first time. That's what struck me as I watched the webinar that you did with Josh Long. Was it Grails for Spring to Boot developers, something like that?
Yeah, I forget the exact title, but that's what it was.
Yeah, if you Google that,
yep.
Yeah, it's still available. In fact, you're doing a presentation based on that, and you'll have more time than you had in the webinar.
That's right. And in just a bit, I'm actually going to have to run away here.
Right.
We're doing a very similar presentation. Josh is here, and we're doing a similar thing here at J3 Summit just in about 20 minutes.
But I was really struck when you generated the scaffolding in Grails. That was 3.3.1, I suppose.
We might have been using 2. Yeah, that was before 1. So
right.
2. So it was 3.3.1 probably.
3.3.2, I just found yesterday or the day before, something like that. Just did my upgrade and I saw that. At any rate, you generated the scaffolding, and suddenly the controller was much simpler. It had an injected service in it, and the service had all the normal methods. In fact, if anything, it resembled what Spring Data does. It looked like an interface where you could add additional methods like Spring Data does, except that these were the normal Gorm methods. And so I guess the thing that jumped out at me, other than the fact that you now have the separation of the transactional service, which is wonderful, was also that Gorm, of course, always generated these methods for you on demand, right? So the difference now is, if I understand this correctly, is that was done at runtime and this is done at compile time? Is that correct?
If you speak about dynamic finders, then yes, dynamic finders were purely runtime implementation, and obviously they had the downside of not being able. They don't work in a kind of a static compilation context. Well, actually, they do. We have something called Grails compile static that enables that, but generally they are purely dynamic methods.
You can't call them from Java, is what.
That's right. You can't call them from Java and so forth.
Right. Although actually, when you did that, I learned the intercept, cache, and invoke pattern from your discussions of partly of how Gorm supposedly, I don't know, in the early days, would generate these methods and then cache them on the meta class and all of that.
Yeah.
But you're saying that's still different from what we're doing now, then, right?
Well, I mean, you mentioned earlier about how Grails is completely different to the way it was 10 years ago, or 7 years ago. And if you look at the evolution of Grails in the early versions, everything was done with metaprogramming, and everything was dynamic. And as the technology has evolved and Groovy has matured and the framework has matured, we've started to incorporate techniques that are better than metaprogramming. And there are features of Groovy such as traits, such as AST transformations that really eliminate the need to do any kind of dynamic metaprogramming. So that particular pattern that you talked about was a valid technique at the time, but I wouldn't recommend anybody do that today.
Interesting.
With Groovy, the way it's evolved, and with features like traits and AST transformations and the ability to statically compile code. So we're at a different evolutionary period with Groovy and Rails, and architecturally they're very different to what they were 7 years ago. That's why it's and we still have folks that use Rails in 1.x days who have no idea what it offers today and how it differs. So if you haven't tried Rails since those days, it's worth a second look and have a go.
So do the data services use AST transforms, or do they? So it's all compile time.
Right, that's right. They use AST transformations, and it's all compile time, and that's one of the major differences with you mentioned Spring Data. So yes, Spring Data does a similar thing in terms of implementing interfaces for you. However, it does so by using a runtime created proxy,
AOP,
an AOP, and so forth. Data services in Gorm is different because it happens at compile time. So there's and that allows us to do some pretty interesting things as well. So one of the things that Gorm data services will do, for example, is check your parameters and methods that you defined on the interface at compile time. And if there's anything wrong, you'll get a compilation error at compile time rather than a runtime error.
Right,
so
you demonstrated that.
Dynamic finders are a good example of that, right? So traditional dynamic finders, you can invoke a method like person.findAll by age greater than and pass a number as an argument, right? And that's slick, it's expressive, it's easy to read, it's easy to write, it's kind of neat. So you can define that same method in a Gorm data service. You invoke it on the service instead of on the class. So it's just as easy to invoke. But with the Gorm data service method, if you make a typo in the find all by age greater than, so maybe you misspell the word age, that code won't compile. Where with traditional dynamic finders, if you made a typo in the word age there, it compiles fine, and you get a runtime error that says, hey, there's no such property, AG or whatever, at runtime. So it's better to get that kind of feedback at compile time. You get the type checking, you get more efficient code because it's all statically compiled. You get the better transaction management. Gorm data services really are, I think, one of the coolest features in Gorm right now. That my answer to what's the coolest feature in Grails changes about every 3 months because there's something new and cooler all the time, it seems like. But Gorm data services is one of the coolest things that we've produced recently, I think.
We've redesigned the website too, and in the documentation section of the website now, there are links to Gorm-related things, both for relational databases using Hibernate/JPA, as well as all the various NoSQL databases, the popular ones, MongoDB, Neo4j, of course, is very popular, Couchbase, Redis, etc. So I mean, I've used Gorm with MongoDB years ago just to see how nice that worked, and you can still use dynamic finders and criteria queries and everything, and that was really good because it's a completely fundamentally different approach. Now, of course, the other thing that's been added to Grails in the last year or so has been the reactive approach as well. So your event-based RX Gorm as well. So that now I think you had a return type in the keynote of type observable, I think it was, on a domain class, whatever it was. So that was also declared in the data services, so that handles the reactive stuff as well. Yeah,
I mean, talking about the original version of Gorm, it is a fundamentally blocking API, and obviously built on other blocking APIs like Hibernate and JDBC and so forth.
Right.
But there is still benefit to being able to offload those blocking operations to a thread or a thread pool or a scheduler that you can control in terms of tuning it. So we allow you to offload those blocking operations and return an observable and so forth, thus fitting Gorm into kind of reactive scenarios. Separate to that, blocking version of Gorm. Separate to that, you have RX Gorm, which is trying to provide an API that is different to your traditional Gorm that is completely non-blocking. Right. So and obviously, that with RX Gorm, we currently we support MongoDB because it's the only database currently is with the appropriate non-blocking drivers,
right?
To do what we need to do.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with Spring Boot with reactive drivers there. And of course, Spring 5 came out, and that was the big advertised major change, is that they had the Web Flux module. And of course, now they return fluxes and monos and all that. But of course, it only works if you have a reactive driver, and none of the JDBC drivers are reactive. But the MongoDB one was reactive. So it sounds like all that stuff is being handled in Grails as well. I mean, is it ultimately going to use interfaces from reactive streams like publisher and subscriber, or?
Yeah, I mean, the whole reactive space is a fast moving area.
Yeah.
There's innovation happening all the time.
That figures, doesn't it? Sorry.
And, it's, there's changes all the time. So it's nice if there is a now published spec reactive streams. Which various implementations implement, and of course that spec is also part of Java 9.
Right.
The Flow API is essentially the reactive stream spec by another name. It's great that that we can work with that API and therefore support a variety of different reactive libraries from RxJava 1 to RxJava 2 to Project Reactor, or even things like Akka or
Cheapers.
So whatever implements the spec.
Now, I recall you also presented a slide that had event bus on it, I think it was, and that was new to me. I hadn't seen that one before. Was that part, has that been in there a little while now, or is that?
So we had a previous, yes, the events API has been there a while.
Yeah.
But we had the previous implementation was tied to Reactor 2.
Oh, okay.
So we decoupled from Reactor 2 because Reactor 3 is in fact completely different API anyway. So there was no upgrade path from Reactor 2 to 3.
Right.
So we decoupled from Reactor 2, and now the events API can sit on top of RxJava 1, RxJava 2, Reactor 3, or even just a simple executor service that you configure and define.
Oh, that's right.
So that makes it more flexible for different use cases and scenarios. And we also added a variety of different annotations and transformations for things like defining publishers and subscribers that are either or listeners, which are a synchronous version of subscribers. So rather than manually calling the event method and passing your data, you can define a method as being a publisher, and the return value of the method will be published.
So you can get rid of stuff in your domain classes like the event lifecycle callbacks. So in your domain class, you might have after insert, before update, those methods. I think that wasn't a great idea anyway, because often using them relies on injecting stuff into your domain classes, which I think is problematic for other reasons, which we disabled in recent versions of Grails, by the way. DI into domain classes is disabled, largely for performance reasons. But in any case, that having those before insert, before update methods in your domain class, I think a better way to do that is to have an event listener registered as a bean in the context. So you can write a class and have a method in it that accepts pre-insert events, and annotate that method with @listener or @subscribe, depending on whether you want it to be synchronous or asynchronous. And then that will be called as your event handler, right? And it can be asynchronous if you like. And now that code's out of your domain class, and that makes the thing, it improves things in a number of ways. But I advocate folks start taking advantage of the event listeners for the event bus for that sort of stuff, and eliminate your those callback methods in your domain classes.
Now
I see Eric over here nodding his head, and so I've got to go give a talk in about 2.5 minutes. I'm going to get out of this.
You got 15 minutes.
Well, I've got 15 minutes before I have to talk. Would you like to join the gentleman here?
I should mention, by the way, before you do that, congratulations to both of you, because you got that, what do they call it, a basically a lifetime achievement award, right? You got an upside down star, which is all evil and everything. No, it's very nice, right?
That's awesome. But more
rock and roll.
More interesting than that is Eric here. I'm going to go ahead and take the seat. Sorry.
Yep.
So Eric has won the 2017 Grails Community Rockstar Award.
Very good. Yeah.
Thank you very much for all of your contributions, Eric. You're doing great work.
If you're going to talk about them, get in the camera here.
I've got to run.
You got to run. Okay. Well,
make
make
sure you make time to talk about Grails3book.com.
Yes. Okay. Well, thanks, Jeff.
Absolutely.
Yeah. By the way, the other thing I noticed before we move on to that was the move to traits again inside the testing framework.
Yeah.
So that we've just switched over to the @test4 and the mock and all that, and now those are not being used anymore. Instead, you're using domain class test, I think, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
There were various
domain tests and control tests, and so on.
Various traits in there.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, just to be clear, the previous @test4 and mock, etc., is still out there. It's a library that is separate to Grails itself. So, if you're already using that approach, then that continues to exist and it continues to be a thing.
The tests themselves don't look like they were any different.
Yeah, so there's no upgrade hassle on that front. But with AST transforms, it's often a case of finding that balance between some of the cool things they offer and providing a kind of better user experience for consumers of the transform. And in many cases, traits often are superior in that sense because you can kind of Groovy doc the methods they provide, and people can navigate into them, and and they're that bit easier to debug and so forth. Which for certain use cases is important. For others, for other use cases, AST transforms could just be like an implementation detail that you don't care about debugging into them necessarily. But in the case of the test framework, we found that folks found it a little bit maybe frustrating at times understanding how the test framework itself worked. Okay. So the trait-based one is dramatically simplified.
Yeah.
It's just a bunch of traits. It's also designed specifically for Spock. So if you want to if you are a JUnit user for whatever reason, and you're not using Spock, you would need to continue using the AST transform-based approach.
Oh, okay.
So because the trait-based one is designed around Spock extensions and so forth. So, but anyway, it's dramatically simpler, easier to understand, which will make folks be able to debug it and contribute to it as well, improving it a lot easier.
Yeah, one thing I noticed when I was testing out the new trait framework is that there was a feature I wanted, but I could just mix two traits together and get that feature I wanted. So I can take your trait.
Composition of the traits is useful.
So take your traits, my traits, and kind of mix them together, or make a new test trait based on it.
Yeah. So obviously traits are great because you can still subclass specification from Spock, but then you can implement various traits to, like you can implement controller tests and service tests and combine them into controller-led tests that injects the service, and that kind of.
So it feels more like an integration test, even though it's still a unit test. Really.
Yeah.
Interesting. Now, another thing that I noticed when I was browsing around the website is the newly redesigned website has a nice link to the various profiles as well, which has always been under-documented, if you will.
Yeah. So the profile feature is really cool. It's a way to extend the types of apps you can build with Grails, and we've had a number of third-party profiles contributed as well for developing apps with Grails and Varden and other frameworks and so forth. And but we improving the discoverability and the documentation around them was always a task that was kind of left on the back burner to-do list. So it's nice that information is now there on the website, accessible and understandable and so forth. And it ties in nicely with the start.grails.org.
Right, the app Forge, I think it's called.
Yeah.
So that's very similar to, again, Spring Boot has a start.spring.io and other frameworks are joining this idea. Again, this is relatively old news for Grails, but it might be new to the listeners. Now you can go to start.grails.org, and just select the features you want, and you can even access it programmatically if you want. And not only does it generate your app, I should mention it also generates the Grails wrapper.
Right.
So that you don't even have to download and install Grails. You can just run from the wrapper.
Yeah, as long, if you have a clean machine with nothing on it, Java is the minimum requirement, obviously. But you can, literally go to start.grails.org, and it's accessible via curl. So you can say curl start.grails.org, and then we'll send you down a zip file, your app, unzip it, and then just do Grails W run app, and we'll run it without having Grails installed at all.
Now, one of the profiles I always liked, and I know you did this in your book, which we'll talk about in a minute, was the REST API profile, of course, includes the JSON views section. And that's another thing that a lot of people don't know about. It's so, now again, this is relatively speaking old news. This has been around in Grails now for at least a couple of versions, at least since 3.0. Do you want to comment at all on the JSON views aspect of it?
Yeah, I mean, what we found is, in the early versions of when folks were starting to use Grails to build REST APIs, most folks turned to the Converters API, in order to kind of convert their kind of domain class or objects into a JSON representation. And what ended up happening was people would have a lot of logic in registering different kind of marshalers and so forth, to marshal objects to JSON. And it ended up becoming a bit of a mess, because essentially what you're doing there is essentially defining your view logic, but somewhere else, either in like bootstrap.groovy would be massive, or as beans, or somewhere else in your app would be these marshalers defined, instead of the logical place, which is as a view. The requirement is normally quite simple. A lot of people are happy with the default JSON that Grails generates, but sometimes you want to deviate, or you want to modify the representation, or only render a certain amount of properties, or change the name of field. And it makes absolute sense to define that kind of view rendering logic essentially in a view. And JSON views is essentially your equivalent of GSP or whatever, but for producing JSON. So and it's they're statically compiled templates that essentially are easy to understand and follow, and support for things like HAL and JSON API and various mix and so forth.
As I recall, that documentation is now split onto another section too. So that's at what
views.grails.org.
Yeah.
And the whole project actually is relatively flexible in that it's called views.grails.org, not JSON views.grails.org, because the whole infrastructure and code base is based on the notion that the view could be produced kind of any format. So there's actually a markup views sub-project, for example, which lets you, using Groovy's markup builder, define a view, and if you're producing XML, which I'm not sure if anybody does anymore, but leaving it flexible and open for other use cases.
I know the GSP wound up under gsp.grails.org as well, so that's moved around also.
Yeah, so so GSP is not completely split out from Grails, and again, going back to that, how much Grails has changed over the years, over the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years. It's very modular now, so GSP is separated out into a separate sub-project. The async libraries are a separate sub-project. GORM is a separate sub-project. The actual core Grails project is actually really quite small now. It's essentially a plugin system and some of the web layer APIs.
That reminded me of one other thing you commented on, is that by working with some of these modularization approaches, you managed to cut down the size of the output WAR file, jar file, whatever it is you happen to be using, considerably. Right?
Yeah, so we eliminated a lot of third-party dependencies and modularized Grails a lot better. So Grails 3.2 application weighed in at about 75 megabyte or something, and a Grails 3.3 application is essentially around half that in size.
So that'll be much better for microservices deploying in the cloud or what have you.
Any space saving, obviously we're not going to use as much bandwidth as Netflix or anything, but saving bandwidth, I'm sure somewhere is going to help.
I think those are all the major features I can think of that you brought up in the keynote. Is there anything you wanted to say about things coming in the future, any time frames or any of that?
Yeah, well, on the Grails forefront, we're waiting on some of our kind of dependent projects to be released. So obviously Grails is built on Spring Boot, and it's built on Spring. So Spring 5 is out, but Spring Boot 2 is still not out yet. So we're waiting for that to happen. And we also have to monitor and check what final version of Hibernate we agreed to commit to for Grails 4 and Gorm 7. So once those things are out and stabilized, then we'll update the core framework, and obviously all of those core dependencies are also dropping support for Java 7, so be Java 8 baseline. So makes sense at that point to name it Grails 4. And so that's Grails 4 will be a 2018 thing for sure. We're not prepared to commit to any kind of date yet. But yeah.
Well, that it sounds like that's still a little bit away, which means that we're going to be comfortably with Grails 3 for a little while. Mm-hmm. And one of the challenges people have had with Grails 3 is that there were no books on Grails 3. Everything was on 2.x, and therefore you had to go to the user manual, which was good, but still it'd be nice to have something that was a coordinated tutorial designed to teach you Grails 3, which is basically my segue to we now have a Grails 3 book, right?
Yes.
And it's ironic, by the way, that this is not why you won the award, interestingly enough, right?
No, that's right. It's fantastic that Eric has, beyond the book, contributed so much to the community. He is literally the whole time answering questions on Slack and provided a huge amount of contribution over the years to the plugins, to the website, to a whole bunch of stuff. So we appreciate everything that he's done over the years.
Yeah, Jeff mentioned that there was a poll for the community award who would, because the logical person to give it to was going to be Eric anyway.
Yeah.
And then they went, well, actually, we should open this up to the community. Yeah. And overwhelmingly, the decision was.
Yeah, it was an easy decision for other folks, I think.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. And I didn't expect it. And the way it was delivered to me last night, it was, kind of interesting. I didn't realize it was coming. So it's
that's why you had your Midwest JavaScript shirt.
Yeah. No, I have a Grails shirt now, so I didn't realize I'd be standing in front of a camera. So yes, no, I appreciate it. I mean, Grails is an awesome framework, and I got this nice little grill.
What does it say actually? Does it say on there, Eric it's Helgeson, right? Grails Rockstar 2017. Isn't that gorgeous? I mean, something to aspire to in the community.
Yes, and
that's awesome.
Yeah, I appreciate. I mean, I'm just part of the community. I like to, help people, help solve problems. Writing the book was something I always wanted to do. It was a lot of work, but got it done. But yeah, Grails is a great framework. It's I love developing it. I love helping people, building things. So it's awesome to be recognized for that. And
we've mentioned the book previously on the podcast. But what's different this time, of course, is that it's about ready to go 1.0, right?
It'll go 1.0 this week. I've been preparing my slides. I'm speaking today at 3 o'clock, so I will hit the 1.0 button here this Friday. So
conference-driven development.
Yep, exactly. There's just a couple minor things, but it'll be 1.0, and it'll be a living book as well. So it's based on Grails 3.2 right now. It'll be updated to Grails 3.3 when a couple of plugins that I use in the book are updated, and when Grails 4 comes out, maybe it'll be upgraded to Grails 4. I'll have to buy a new domain name though, because it's Grails 3 book.
Yeah,
that's right. That's again, we have to emphasize it's Grails 3 book.
Maybe we should start adopting like Chrome-like version numbers, or Firefox.
Yes, exactly. 14, well, I actually 15. Did. Grails 67.
Just as long as we avoid
make
Java
it expensive for you.
Yes,
the domain name.
And so it's all self-published, by the way. So you don't have to go to any particular publisher's website. Just go to Grails 3 book. It's with an actual number 3. Right.
Yep. And I actually did register practicalgrails.com just
because
did you? So I wouldn't have to keep registering new domain names. So I'll make this switch in a little bit, but and my site is green, not orange yet. So
we'll change that in time.
We're gonna win that battle eventually. I mean. You never let graphic designers, run wild and
No, but I've been working out. So like little backstory was that last year at GreatConf, I said if no one announces a book, I'll start writing one, and it's taken about a little over a year. I've been working, just right around a year. I've been working on it. So writing a book is hard in your spare time, and 3 going on 4 kids and lots of competing priorities. So
congratulations, by the way, going on.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Now, one thing I noticed in the book, I haven't been through the latest version yet, obviously, but one thing that's really interesting about the book that you don't find elsewhere is you have a lot about deployments to the cloud.
So I've done a lot of systems admin stuff and DevOps stuff. So that's I like having really simple, easy deployment as code and things like that. So I have some pretty detailed tutorial on how to do some deployments in there, and I'll as I said, it's a living book, so I'll kind of keep adding more in there as users are, give me feedback too. That's there's been quite a few people who have given me very detailed feedback in email or forum or other things like that. So,
which providers did you? I remember there was an AWS deployment in there. Yeah. There was a couple others.
AWS is I have AWS. I'm going to add Heroku and I can't remember the other one.
See, that's the thing. I mean, if you look at the way Grails was created, sometimes a framework is almost too successful, because what happens is it's so successful that it's tied to the problem that it's solved, and it gets associated with that in people's minds. And when the problems that you're solving change, they forget to go look again. Grails was ideally suited to your traditional Spring Hibernate generated view web app, which was the thing we did 10, 15 years ago. Now in this world of microservices and contained containers web containers rather than deployment to web containers, people don't think of Grails, and they really should, because it's changed so much and it's so productive that way now.
I talk about all the traditional stuff in the book, but I also focus on a lot of the API and kind of stateless microservice stuff so you can deploy apps quickly, succinctly, and a lot of the recent changes you were talking about. Disabling domain class injection, and anecdotally it saved half the memory in my app, just disabling that. It took a little work to rework a few things, but it's worth it because my memory went down by half. So
wow, that's dramatic. That's a lot.
Basically the reason for that is the Spring produces a lot of dependency injection metadata, and it does so at runtime. And the bigger your class file, the more memory that consumes.
Okay.
So as you go adding methods, and in the case of domain classes, they tend to end up being quite big classes because of the GORM entity API and so forth, all the static methods and so forth. So that's why one of the reasons we recommend people turn off dependency injection, save memory, save performance.
You did mention, by the way, one scary thing to me during your talk is you said apparently the Hibernate people are going to get rid of the criteria API.
Yeah.
Which I'm like, what are you talking about? I mean, Grails, of course. Now, I used the criteria API in Hibernate years ago, and it was ugly and awkward, you know. But Grails made that so easy with the with criteria builder and the create criteria builder and detach criteria and everything. Until the where queries came along, I used that all the time.
Yeah.
So, how's this going to affect Grails? When is this supposed to happen? What's the future on that? Do you know?
Well, first of all, most people who build Grails applications don't interact directly with the criteria API. It's we use it internally. So when you use things like criteria builder and detach criteria and all that kind of stuff, you're not writing logic that is interacting directly with the Hibernate criteria API. You're writing logic against GORM APIs that we then translate into the Hibernate criteria.
Right.
So
criteria will still work.
Right. So there should be no reason. It's more of a problem for us. We have to update the internals of GORM in this case to work against the JPA query builder API instead of the Hibernate criteria API.
Oh, so it's not really getting rid of Hibernate criteria builder. It's using It's using JPA instead.
It's using JPA instead.
Oh, okay.
So JPA,
you did say that,
JPA
actually.
2 and above has a equivalent of the criteria API, and we have to switch the internals of GORM to use that. It's probably something we should have done a while ago. But if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah, and it'll all be clean to the users, is what you're saying.
So, yeah, really, the only case that the user would be impacted is if they were directly interacting with the Hibernate criteria API.
That's risky anyway.
Which is not normally in most Grails applications. No, don't do that. So. Yeah, it's a problem for us, and we'll solve it and do the necessary upgrades.
Okay, well, I'm not worried anymore.
So you shouldn't worry. There's nothing to worry about.
Was there anything else in the book that specifically that we haven't talked about that you find interesting or dramatic or whatever?
No, I think I took the perspective of when I built the book is, day to day I built Grails apps. That's consultant, and so I took that experience and kind of what I've learned as building apps, and I kind of applied it in a practical way. Like, how do I solve my problem? And I kind of illustrate problems and show how to solve those problems in Grails and with the benefits that Grails gives you. So I think that's I just kind of like that approach when books kind of go through like a real, like, here's your problem and here's how you solve it. So that's just kind of all the examples and all the things through the book. That's the approach I took. So
yeah, I think the one thing we didn't mention is the actual name of the book. I mean, we mentioned the website.
Yes.
So the book is called
Practical Grails 3.
Practical Grails 3, right?
Awesome.
Right, which eventually will be Practical Grails 3 Plus or whatever, 3 and 4 or whatever you like there.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, we definitely wish you the best of luck on that. Definitely congratulations on the award, which had nothing to do with that. So just, all the more reason. And I really appreciate you taking the time. The keynote, I assume the slides will be available eventually somewhere.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll publish them at the end of the conference.
Yeah, and Jeff had to leave, but we never really liked him anyway, right?
Yeah, that's
so
true.
It doesn't matter.
No great loss. No.
Yeah, exactly. So he's talking spring stuff now.
Yeah,
so I mean, what are you going to do? But I very much appreciate you taking the time. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
We'll see you a little bit later as well.
Awesome.
Thank you.